Under unremitting attack and losing its top brass, is Iran at risk of dangerous destabilization? With extremist groups already in the region, foreign interference as well as internal division, could a power vacuum cause Iran to descend into civil strife and even provide a safe haven for regional extremists? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is Iran. The destabilization of any country poses a myriad of risks. But in the Middle East, in a country like Iran with 90 million people, there is any number of unknown dangers. When regional neighbors Syria and Iraq fell into civil war, Iran and its powerful security apparatus managed to avoid extremist groups like Daesh and al-Qaeda from taking root. But under relentless attack from the US and Israel, and top-ranking members of its leadership killed, can Tehran maintain that security and unity? Or could it follow the fate of its once dangerously destabilized neighbors? Here's a look.
The US has already claimed multiple tactical victories in Iran. Washington has severely degraded Iran's Navy, Air Force, missile launch capabilities and drone facilities. The death of Ali Khamenei in the first day, and Tuesday's killing of Ali Larijani, a prominent Iranian security chief, allow the US and Israel to point to several military goals achieved. But on the joint US-Israeli goal of regime change, that is far less certain. In the past, US-led regime change in the Middle East is slow, messy, protracted and violent, and ultimately unsuccessful. It also leads to mission creep. The US's 2003 invasion of Iraq to topple Saddam Hussein and rid Iraq of weapons of mass destruction which ultimately did not exist was, in then US President Bush's words, a war on terror.
The remnants of Saddam's regime are still dangerous, and terrorists are gathering in Iraq to undermine the advance of freedom. Al-Qaeda and the other global terror networks recognize that the defeat of Saddam Hussein's regime is a defeat for them. They know that a democratic Iraq in the heart of the Middle East would be a further defeat for their ideology of terror.
But terror groups like Al-Qaeda, which became a household name in global political discussions in the 2000s and onwards, did not have a presence in Iraq prior to the US invasion. They coalesced, descending from abroad, and took root amid the power vacuums and security gaps that arose in the aftermath of the US invasion. In neighbouring Syria, during the much more recent civil war under the autocratic regime of Bashar al-Assad, terror group Daesh swelled in numbers and in influence in the region. Is Iran set to experience a similar collapse of authority and become a breeding ground for further extremism and terror?
A short time ago, the United States military began major combat operations in Iran. Our objective is to defend the American people by eliminating imminent threats from the Iranian regime, a vicious group of very hard, terrible people.
The country of more than 90 million people is led by a religious head. But beneath the supreme leader is a complex mosaic of established institutions, some constitutional, others bureaucratic, some are security-led, and others still religious. The toppling of individual leaders like Saddam Hussein in Iraq and Bashar al-Assad in Syria might not be a useful parallel for Trump, the way the killing of Ali Khamenei was. In Iran, the new leader was chosen quickly following the death of Khamenei. There are procedures, transfers of power, separations of authority, and divisions of governance. Iran's rule is designed to resist power vacuums, in the short term at least. But one thing appears certain for now: Iran is not capitulating, and the war has not ended swiftly the way Trump had anticipated. At the very least, Iran has that in common.
Well, joining me now to look further at the potential for destabilization and its consequences are from London. Visiting fellow in international relations and security at Loughborough University and former senior Royal Air Force officer Afzal Ashraf. From Washington, adjunct professor in political science, Middle East and Islamic studies at George Mason University, Reza Khanzadeh. And also from London, founder of the Global Political Research Center, Alexander Claxon. Thank you all so much for being with me. Reza, I'll begin with you. Just begin by describing really the cultural mosaic that is Iran, as well as the factions that are competing politically. You know, conservatives versus reformists, for example. How unified or not is the country under the surface?
Yeah, thanks for having me. That's a great question to start off with, and it's a very, very loaded answer as well. So I'll try to make it short. But I've actually done research on this with my upcoming book, and I've essentially broken it down into four camps inside Iran, and it's what we can call the outsiders and versus the insiders. And as far as those considered the insiders, it's anyone who has either pledged allegiance to this regime or has any kind of connection, whether it's through bloodline or through marriage, or even for financial reasons. Considering how dire the economy is, a lot of the people that follow this regime do it because it's a paycheck. But what we have to consider, again, like your program showed in the beginning, we have 90 million people. And of that 90 million, if we take the lowest end of the data that we are able to collect, 9 million people support this regime. And that's not counting the 200,000 that's already part of the, that's part of the IRGC. And that's not counting the almost 1 million part of the Basij, which is the plainclothes paramilitary arm of the IRGC. And then on top of that, we do have the different types of factions, the moderates and the reformists. But when it's all said and done, they all are, lockstep in line with what this regime is trying to do, which is survive. So if we see any type of weakness within the country that could even give a hint of some type of uprising or civil war, I think we'll start seeing that 9 million people that support the regime, that 200,000 that are part of the IRGC, that almost 1 million that support or that are part of the Basij, they will all, coalesce and join and unite and mobilize to, defend this country, whether it's the Kurds coming from, the West, or it's, the Baluchis or the Turks even. There is a, Turkish population in Iran as well, and also the Arabs. But I think when it's all said and done, it's a very nationalistic, country, even though there's a large percentage, a vast majority of the population do not support this regime and want to see it change in one shape or form, whether it's regime change or just like extreme levels of reform. They still do not want to see their country go into chaos, because we have to consider that
prolonging this attack and this assault on Iran could effectively, strengthen whatever unity, that string of unity that is there among these groups that are fractured right now. That's the risk. Let me turn to Alexander, though. You'd actually said yourself that destabilizing Iran risks triggering internal fragmentation and regional instability. So how so?
Well, unfortunately, we've seen this historically in other countries where regime change has been carried out, specifically by the United States with the support of Israel. Of course, everyone knows what happened in Iraq when Saddam Hussein was ousted, and Daesh or ISIS essentially managed to take over both parts of Iraq and Syria. We saw this also in Libya, when Gaddafi was murdered by the opposition, but instead of a democratic government taking place, we've seen Libya essentially become a failed state, with factions still continuing to operate within Libya. My concern is that for Israel specifically, their goal in this conflict is essentially to ensure that Iran becomes, well, either a failed state or a completely weakened state, and they don't really care how that happens. In fact, this is not a conspiracy. Numerous Israeli officials have stated that their primary goal is to ensure that Iran will no longer ever be a threat to Israeli hegemony in the region. So from that point of view, they wouldn't mind strategically if Iran becomes divided, either on ethnic grounds or on religious grounds, and whether or if extremist groups manage to take over the country. That could be a divergency between Israel and the United States, because the United States, I don't think they'll want Iran to become completely overrun by extremist groups. But unfortunately, we have Israel, which is also running the show right now.
Yeah, and so with that, Ashraf, speak to us more about the potential for contagious kind of destabilization and how it could affect Iran's immediate neighbors by giving us a better idea of what extremist groups really exist in the region and how they might be viewing Iran and potential opportunities in Iran's destabilization, not least, you know, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, Daesh, Khorasan, which isn't too far away. What's really out there?
Well, there's a great deal out there. I think you've heard some names already. There's about, I think, more than half a dozen Kurdish groups, and then there's 2 or 3 significant Balochi groups, Jaish al-Adl for one, and several Arab separatist groups in the Ahwaz area. So I don't think it serves a great deal of purpose to list them because none of them have a coherent strategy, and none of them have had any significant impact. There have been allegations of various attacks against the IRGC. There have been attacks against other areas using IEDs, improvised explosive devices. But whether they form anything like a significant destabilization force, like, for example, the example we were given just now of ISIS in Iraq, that I don't think is a realistic probability in this situation. And in terms of the spillover, as you've suggested, at the moment there is no real indication that these groups and these conflicts are going to spill over into the regional countries. I think all the regional countries are taking reasonable care to avoid this to varying degrees. Of course, Iraq is limited in what it can do along the sort of Kurdish areas. But I think the greatest destabilization threat comes from the proxy groups, the covert operations within Iran that we know exist. We know from open source intelligence that Mossad has operated in Iran, carrying out very significant assassinations and disruption of supply routes, particularly associated with the nuclear project. But we also have unconfirmed reports, and that's the nature of covert operations. They can't really be confirmed, that many of the so-called uprising and protests have been masterminded and supported by external intelligence agencies. And that is something the Iranians understand very well because they have a history of that, going back to 1953. And it's these sort of factors that will actually help unite people around the regime rather than fragment the country as things currently stand.
Okay. I mean, in a sense, that's a kind of optimistic outlook because it's the seems to be the lesser evil that you're describing. But when you talk about the other extremist groups in the region, you say they don't have a cohesive strategy. Well, not now, but I mean, neither did Daesh. We didn't even know it existed. Following the invasion of Iraq, and it found a way to manifest itself into the fabric of the entire region, really. Let me turn to Reza, though, because, you know, there's another angle here to the long-term consequences in that memories are long in the Middle East. So even if the consequences of the cycle of revenge, I'll call it, don't manifest now or even soon, they could be a decade down the line or more.
For sure, yeah, that's absolutely true. And we have to consider that in the past almost 2 years now, as far as the protests internally inside Iran, we as the outside observers have been introduced to a new generation, Generation Z. And this is a generation that has no memories, no experiences, no PTSD from that 79 revolution and the 8-year war and the rebuilding essentially of a nation and how difficult it was, especially under extreme sanctions. So when you speak to that generation, they want regime change by any means necessary. They want this entire structure out. So if we're thinking long term, 10 years down the line or even longer down the line, that's the generation to keep an eye on. Not so much, I don't think, the different factions within the nation or the different, ethnic cultural groups within the nation. Because again, when we compare Iran with Iraq, Libya, and, Syria, those three Arab countries, those three Muslim countries, when their top leader, when their essentially when their dictator was taken down, that's when the chaos ensued. But with Iran's government, it is so complex, it is so interwoven with itself. It has so many different systems that it's almost like a marble statue. You can start chipping away at it from the top, but that statue is still standing, and that's what we're faced with this regime, that it has so many different roots embedded into the nation. But it's that newer generation, because even with Mojtaba Khamenei coming into power, if he's still alive or if he's still healthy enough to to rule in the next 10 and plus years, that is generation, that's the newer generation, Generation X. But then you have Generation Y and Generation Z, and we might see if Israel and the United States are able to essentially take out more of the top brass, the top echelon of the regime, of the IRGC, that's when you might see a faction within that insider group I was talking about before, because you have the active members of the regime and the passive members. And those passive members are, middle-ranked, lower-ranked officials in the regime that are looking for a way out. They're the ones I mentioned before, who are only loyal because it's a paycheck. But once they start to see that change might happen, they could defect, they could unite and mobilize and transition this entire country into a more, shouldn't say peaceful, but I guess, relatively peaceful country, and then maybe allow its citizens to have more freedoms, because the most important thing for this regime is its own survival. So if that means giving its people more freedom, they would be okay with that. But then they're going to be up against, like I said, Generation Z, who just has so much hatred for this regime that might not be enough for them.
Let me go back to Reza then, because earlier, Reza, when we spoke, you did see off-ramp options. But that was just a few days. I'm sorry, Alexander. You had said you saw these off-ramp options as well, but that was just, a relatively few days into the conflict. So where do you see the possibilities now, weeks in?
Well, I'm quite pessimistic at the moment in terms of an off-ramp, because if the United States were to declare victory, it will be a very hollow one for them, because, of course, the regime is still in place and they're still able to control the Straits of Hormuz. And, in fact, the regime might be even more hardened against the United States and Israel than even before. And that's, of course, also the case because Israel keeps taking out what one would consider relatively moderate factions and individuals within Iran. And then from Iran's point of view, they will actually want this conflict to continue for as long as possible. Now, that might sound surprising, but actually it makes strategic sense, because Iran wants to inflict as much pain as possible on the United States economically, and on the Gulf countries, which host many of the American bases, to essentially send a message: do not do this again. Because, of course, we've seen Iran has been attacked continuously last year and this year and then previously before with assassinations. And of course, they've had enough, and they want to send a message that we're not going to take it anymore. So that they'll want to inflict global economic pain around the world, and especially in the Gulf countries, and then to essentially request or demand some kind of a security structure which would ensure that the United States and Israel does not do it again. So they will want to prolong this conflict for the foreseeable future. Okay. So I'm really quite pessimistic, unless the United States is able to take a perception loss, essentially, and admit victory, even though it would be a hollow one.
Yeah. You know, Reza, my apologies, because I've been speaking to so many people about this. It was actually you who had described the off-ramp. Yeah, excuse my confusion. Very quickly then, because I want to go back to Afzal about his analysis here. Do you still see those off-ramps that you described, or is the opportunity now been lost?
Well, that's almost, I don't like to say the beauty, but that's almost the beauty of the way Trump approached this, even though it's been, unhinged at times and riddled with contradictions and, hypocrisy. And, in one speech, Trump, contradicts himself and says two different things. And that's just Trump. We haven't even gotten to his cabinet and his entire staff. But I think that plays into that level of opportunity that Trump has, where he can, essentially invent his own off-ramp. At any moment he could say that this has been a success. We've essentially destroyed every military capability of this regime, its Air Force, its Navy, its, factories. So he could do that, create a success story for himself, and then let Israel and Iran continue the conflict. Yeah. And then weeks or months down the line, re-enter the conflict as the quote unquote peacemaker, and then try to, build some type of, cease deal or, truce.
It's fascinating. So his off-ramp would be to kind of contradict himself again and then get out of it all. Okay, let me come back to Afzal, though, because in the meantime, now that we have so many of the top leaders of Iran's regime taken out, tell us what you think about who replaces those figures that the U.S. and Israel have now eliminated, and could they inadvertently be creating a more radical Iranian regime, to the point, we have expressions in every language that's basically either better the devil you know. In Turkish, they say the one who comes makes you miss the one who left. What do you see, Afzal?
The short answer to your question is I don't know. And I don't think many of us do. But the possibility, as you described, is certainly there. And I think the likelihood is certainly there. I think one of the things that we mustn't forget is that a lot of this war has been publicly, at least, attributed to the possibility of nuclear weapons. And the last supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, was one of the few people in the history of mankind to have provided a religious ruling against those type of weapons. There are people in Iran who will probably want to have them. So it's very likely that through these assassinations, many of these relatively reasonable people have been removed, and the desperate situation will call for a leader that is much more desperate, much more hardline, and that's certainly what history points us to. So I think those possibilities exist. I'd just like to go back to some of the discussion you've had, which I think links to this point here. And that is, you mentioned that, yes, my analysis of the terrorist group is optimistic. Well, I was trying to make it neutral. The point is this. When Daesh, as you described, took over Iraq and a lot of this Syrian area, at some point, between it being al-Qaeda in Iraq and becoming Daesh in Syria, there is evidence of external state involvement in empowering it and utilizing it for the purposes of regime change. And it's very likely, and already attempts can be seen by states, particularly Western states, to encourage and support entry into Iran from Kurdish forces, at least in Iraq. And a great deal of covert operations will be taking place. Covert operations now in modern warfare are a larger proportion of the conventional warfare that they were historically. So we mustn't ignore them simply because we can't see them. Their existence can be seen indirectly. And in terms of the discussion on the off-ramp, there is one area that I think we are neglecting, and that is the presence of the Israelis. Now, President Trump was dragged into this war. It's becoming increasingly clear simply because the Israeli government, the Israeli prime minister, decided to attack. And one of the reasons he was drawn into it was because once the Israelis attack, the American forces in the region become targets. Now, if President Trump walks away, he would have to consider removing his forces in all of the region, really, to stop them continuing to be targets. So there is a complicating factor here. We talk about President Trump, we talk about Americans, but for the first time in a study of warfare, and I've been studying warfare for a long time, I can't think of a conflict where two allies are working together with different purposes, different objectives, and those are the words of Secretary of War Hesketh, different objectives, and you can't have any strategy around that situation at all. And so any discussion on off-ramps or even escalation is problematic because there is no coherent strategy, no coherent objective, and no coherent basis of even negotiation here.
Okay, Reza, I can give you a minute to respond to that.
I completely agree, but Trump has essentially broken all the rules, right? He's not in the same world as as Dr. Ashraf and I are, and he can essentially make up things, right? He can just make up something and find a way to make it a success. So even though I completely agree with the doctor, I feel like for Trump, he's kind of immune to these kind of things, right? He's able to find a way, because even with the 12-day war, I'm sure you guys remember he was on the lawn of the White House about to board his helicopter when he was putting an end to that 12-day war, and then on live camera he said both of these countries don't know what the F they're doing. Like, he cussed live on TV, and then he called Netanyahu again and said, you need to stop bombing Iran, and he did. Netanyahu stopped. So Trump's approach to this is not diplomatic. Excuse me. He's not a politician, obviously. So I think he's kind of immune to these, realistic, views that we all have and share.
Making it almost impossible to make any coherent predictions of any sort as to where or how this could go. Unfortunately, guys, that's all the time we have. We need to leave it there. We could continue this discussion for hours, but I'd like to thank all three of you really so much for being with me on this edition of the Newsmakers, our viewers for joining us as well. Remember, you can follow us on social media, and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.